Sam, thanks so much for being on the program. And thanks for writing this book, Make My Church Safe, a guide to the best practices to protect children and secure your congregation from harm. My first question, I guess, is the why question. Why did you feel like it was necessary to write this book?
Well, that's probably one of the more important questions because it was my own church that drove me to write this book. We take child safety very seriously, really the safety of any vulnerable person. And I was looking for a resource to help me train my church, equip my church. And there was a lot of good stuff out there on, abuse. There was a lot of good stuff out there on like active shooters and things. But there was not a book that I could just give to my church members that was a comprehensive view of church safety. And I thought, you know what? If it's not out there, I'm going to write it and hopefully people will receive it well. I think it's one of the most important issues in the church today. And so I wanted to address that.
You say in the introduction of the book that pastors, in fact, have a dual calling. Can you say a little bit more about that idea? What do you mean by a dual calling?
Yeah, I think this is ultimately a spiritual problem. I don't want to diminish any sort of physical threats, of course, but I do think that the root cause is spiritual. And every church is supposed to be internally safe so that we can equip people for external dangers. So the way I view it is, you know, if you are training your people, so somebody who's been harmed or vulnerable or needs healing, that's what you go to the church. Without getting the details, right before this conversation, I was talking to a neighbor. She's going through a very difficult time with something very specific that has caused her tremendous harm. And what did I do? I said, well, we've got a church where you can get some healing. We've got some people that can help you. So you want the church to be this place of safety, this place of healing, for the reason of sending people out into a world that's dangerous. So it's this dual calling. Like, hey, we've got to be internally safe. Why? Because the world is a dangerous place. There are dark things that are going on, and who is supposed to resolve it? Well, Christ ultimately resolves it, but how are people going to know about Christ without the church going forward? So, yeah, every church has a dual calling of internal safety so that people can be ready and equipped and sent out for external dangers.
Sam, the nature of my work here at Ministry Watch is that we often cover that darkness. We do so not to tear down the church, but hopefully to shine a light on what's going on. Ephesians says that we should have no fellowship with evil deeds of darkness, instead expose them, and we take that verse as an important part of our calling here at Ministry Watch. But I do think that sometimes it can create an impression that that's all that's going on in the church. In other words, whenever we hear these stories day after day after day of fallen pastors and broken churches and churches that are unsafe, there is a risk of creating a false impression. So I just wanted to ask you your opinion. Is this problem greater today than in years past, or are we just facing it more honestly than we have in the past?
Both, maybe. There was definitely a season in the American church. Let's just kind of, we could talk globally and there's any number of things that we could discuss, but let's just kind of discuss the North American church in the last 100 years. I think there was a season where a lot of things were covered up, where things were not shown forth. There was almost this, terrible unwritten rule of, wasn't almost, there was a terrible unwritten rule that you don't talk about that. So I think that there is to some degree more light, and I welcome that light. I said that it's needed, that we need to do that. But these people are people, and where there are people, there are problems, and where there are problems, there's some very severe problems, and people can do some horrible things. So I think that it's a little bit of both, where yes, we're looking at this more, and we need to. Is the problem worse? If you were experiencing some bad things 50 or 75 years ago, well, I mean, it doesn't mean anything to you because you experienced something a while back. But I do think that the hypersexuality of culture, pornography, the accessibility of some of these things, how you can have access in ways that you didn't in the past. I do think that there is something to, there's a greater weight here that we may all be feeling. So I think it's kind of a both end. Are we looking at it more? Yes. Is the problem worse? Probably. But it doesn't matter to me. Problems are problem. People are people. We need to deal with the things that are in front of us, and we just need to tackle this problem. Whether or not it's more or not, it's almost irrelevant. Let's deal with it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's get into some of the details of how to deal with it, because one of the things that I really loved about your book, thought it was a real virtue, I'm guessing that it's because it did start out in your local church, that this started out as a handbook or a guidebook, and then you've expanded it to be a little bit more universal. Is that accurate, first of all?
Yes, yeah, it started with our own policies and procedures. It started with us thinking as a church internally about the best way to handle this. And then it obviously just expanded out from there. Um, so we have a lot of foster children in our church. And that's really where all of this started was when I came to West Bradenton Baptist Church, um, I asked the community, what's the greatest problem? And because that's where I want the church to be. Whatever the biggest issue is in the community, the church needs to be at the forefront of helping solve that problem. Now, every community is going to be different. For us, it was heroin trafficking and human trafficking. We're right by a port. There was a lot of heroin here. As a result, there was a lot of human trafficking, and with human trafficking and things like that comes children who've been harmed, families who are falling apart, and a foster system that is just full, completely full. And there were no places for these children. So I went to my church and myself was licensed as a foster parent and just said, let's take these kids. If we're pro-life, which we are, we should take these children. And so we just started, goodness, we dozens of foster kids at any one time in my church. And who knows how many throughout all the years that we have fostered. Now from that, so when you foster, you are connected immediately to some of the worst problems in families in your community. And with that comes, we need to report this. Wow, this child has been harmed. Oh my goodness, we've just heard something. What do I say? What do I do? And we started having to tell our people, like, you need to report this. You need to go down this pathway. It is the best way to handle this situation. It's something that I feel very strongly about because I've fostered children. I've adopted a child out of the foster system. We saw a lot of abuse, a lot of bad things. These kids get removed for very specific reasons. They don't just remove kids because the system's full. To have your kid removed, some bad things have really had to happen. And we've even had some situations where we've had to report our own families for some things. And I wanted as tight a process as possible and as safe a church as possible. When you do ministry, you're going to encounter this. I cringe when I hear churches say, we don't have anything like that at my church. I'm like, yes, you do. If you're doing ministry, you will. And that's part of the reason I wanted to write the book, is because if you're going to do good ministry, you're going to have to do these things when it comes to safety. And not just with children, but all vulnerable people. I mean, children is kind of first of mind, as I understand it should be, but there's other vulnerable people too that get swept into this, and we need to make sure that we're protecting everyone that we can.
Yeah. Sam, my wife and I got licensed in North Carolina as foster parents back a few years ago, and it was a fairly elaborate process for us here. I mean, we had to, many weeks. I don't remember now how many weeks of, several hours a night, and there were home checks and background checks and everything like that. Um, but one of the things that I learned in that process was that uh, what you said, that you really don't know what's going on in your community and in your church until, or let's say it a different way. If you don't think these bad things are happening in your community, in your church, you're just really not paying attention, number one. And number two, this training, it not only protects the kids, but it does protect the church as well. My wife and I learned, how to not put ourselves in vulnerable situations and situations that might later be looked at as questionable situations that we might have done just out of ignorance. Things like mandatory reporting requirements and policies and procedures for taking kids to the bathroom, for example, just really, kind of basic blocking and tackling nuts and bolts. I was gratified to see a whole lot of that in your book. However, just reading it is probably just the first step. What kind of training do you guys do in your church?
Yeah, we actually have a whole resource around this now. You can go to makemychurchsafe.com. So forgive the shameless promo, but that's where you can get some of this training. We've actually put it together in a resource for churches. So not only with the book do we have, I think, pretty good content. I wrote it, so I tend to think that, but we've also got some good video training as well. Every church is going to have some nuance. Every church is going to have a little bit of different stuff they need to do. Our campus is 62,000 square feet. It's been built over several decades. With that comes a facility that tends to be more of a liability than a brand new facility that you just opened up with all the ADA compliance, right? We still have bathrooms we're renovating, trying to get them to that ADA compliance. Now, you may say, well, that's kind of a boring sort of safety issue. Yes and no. If you have trouble getting off of the toilet as an elderly person, that can actually be a pretty serious thing in the church if you have to deal with that on a Sunday morning. So there are some basic things that you might not think about that are also safety issues. So we've put together this comprehensive training to help people really work through this. Things like mission trips. What are you supposed to do? Everyone's excited to go on a mission trip. Every church should be sending people, but there are some very unique things around that you need to do before you go so that you keep people safe. Are kids on this trip? Is it an adults only trip? If there are children, you need to make sure that you've background checked everyone that's going on the trip that's going to be working with a child and making sure that they've been properly vetted. So we did create this resource to help churches. Please understand we made it as comprehensive as we could, but it's still not everything you need. You need to make sure that you're following all the local regulations, all the local laws, that you yourself are asking the question, what more does my church need? I think every ministry area of every church needs to be asking these questions and creating a comprehensive strategy for church safety, because it only takes an incident that ends up in the news that causes great harm. And hear me out, I'm all for if a reporter finds out that something's happened, report it. If you found a church covering something up, report it. But it only takes one instance in the life of a church, of decades of ministry. So we need to be extra vigilant with these issues because they can cause great harm.
Yeah. Sam, there are a lot of great checklists and bits of advice in your book. We can't drill into all of them. Let's just stipulate for the record that we can. So my advice on that score is go get the book, go buy the book, go read the book. And let's just stipulate that for the record. But there are a couple of things that I did want to just mention that jumped out at me. One was that you I don't know if recommended would be the right word. You strongly asserted that no one should be a volunteer in your church with youth until they had been actively involved in your church for a season. In fact, I think you specifically said at least 6 months, and you also qualified that by saying not just 6 months attending the church, but 6 months actively involved, so that person's character and behaviors were known to the other people in the church. I thought that was a really helpful and very specific piece of advice that I know, again, as I cover abuse in the church from over the years. If churches had followed that one piece of advice, they would probably eliminate a half to 2/3 of all the problems that I write about.
People that intend harm, like true wolves and predators, hop from church to church at times to find the vulnerable places. And often time exposes that, but the only way that you can expose it is to give it time. So we are very careful with all of our volunteers. We get somebody who joins the church, they've been believers for years, they're already tithing, they were an elder at their previous church, they've got a good reputation, you've got no reason to suspect anything. Guess what? You're waiting 6 months before you're serving at VBS, potentially even a year. For us, there's no we've hit that 6-month checkpoint. Okay, everyone that's there can serve. That's just the starting point for us. Prove to us as a congregation that you're really here for all the right reasons. that you're willing to be vetted, that you're willing to show yourself faithful, that you're willing to give it a little bit of time before you're around vulnerable people. Now, there, of course, somebody joins joins the church, but for us, it's the join point. It's not just the attend point. It's you've actually committed to our church and membership. Now, there's some things you can do. There's other places you can serve. You just can't serve around vulnerable people. You can't serve in our children's ministry. You can't serve in our student ministry. If you want to serve, we can find a place for you right away. It just might be in a very specific location and a very specific ministry. You can sing in the choir, for instance. You're in front of everybody. There's nothing wrong with that. But yeah, we do make people wait, and we do vet everyone every year, myself included.
Yeah. Well, say more about that, Sam, because that was another thing that that jumped out at me is that you vet people every year. This is not a one and done sort of thing, and y'all do some specific things. For example, all the leadership in your church have some sort of accountability software on their devices, and the wife has access to that. I noted. What are some other things that you guys do, and say more about the importance of having these policies in place?
Yeah, just a quick note on my wife having access to all of the things on my phone. We share our locations with each other, and I'm an ultra marathoner, and I just finished a race, and so she rather enjoyed following me on the path in the wilderness as I was running. So that particular piece actually came in pretty helpful. She's like, "I think you're off course. You need to get back on course."
Oh, that's great. That's funny.
I did get lost for about half a mile on this ultra marathon. Now, on a more serious note, yes, the higher the authority level in the church, the higher you go up the leadership ladder in the church, the more accountability you need, not less. So many churches flip that around. And it's like, well, they're at the top of leadership, they get less accountability. The people at the bottom get more accountability. No, 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 no. It needs to be the other way around. So for our leaders in our church, specifically, we say pastors. Everyone's kind of got a different term for that office, but we say pastors. The pastors in our church have very high levels of accountability. Yes, if it's a church-owned device, we're going to be tracking it. We ask them, we can't make anybody do this, but we are very specific ask, pretty pointed ask that your spouse or somebody very close to you has the ability to look at the things that you're looking at on your devices. We're going to do a giving check. Now, a lot of people don't like that. A lot of people think that's overkill. Hey, I understand. But every year we're looking at if you're paid by the church, we're looking at what you give. And are you tithing on that payment? And I understand there's a lot of debate about the tithe, and you may disagree with me. My point is that there's a lot of accountability. Not just around what you're looking at on devices, and are you hanging around the wrong people? Do you have an accountability partner? But are you actually faithfully supporting the church? That's a warning signal for us. If somebody's getting paid by the church, particularly a full-time employee, and they're not tithing on that payment, that's kind of a warning sign. It could be also a sign that something's, hey, I've got medical bills. Like, well, okay, great. Well, you should have told us. We'll help you. Like, we're not using these things to be oppressive at all. It's just checkpoints. They're warning signs. We're required to have an accountability partner in the church and outside of the church. So I've got several deacons in my church that have full window into my life, can ask anything at any time. We've got cameras everywhere. I do not meet with anybody in a room in the church without a camera present. There's no audio because that's illegal in Florida, but there is a camera there. So I've got eyeballs. That camera points at my computer. So I have the way my computer is positioned in my office. Anyone can view what I'm looking at any time on my laptop. And again, you may say, wow, that just is that sounds like a lot. It is, but if you're doing the right things, you don't even notice. And I think that's where high levels of accountability need to be put in place. We've had some moral failings at West Bradenton. They were dealt with appropriately, thankfully, and don't want to get into them, public show, but we know, we've learned the hard way that you have to do this. And you may say, well, there's some things that I would do differently than you, Sam. That's fine. Just make sure that you have the highest levels of accountability at the highest levels of authority. And then that culture will filter into your church. When you have it flipped around, what you do is you create a culture of exceptions. Well, if the pastor doesn't have to do this, why do I have to do it? And then all of a sudden, down at the bottom levels of authority, people are making exceptions and kind of side passing policies, and it can be a very dangerous situation. So I would say stick to that accountability. It's one of the most important things you can do.
Yeah, at one point in the book, I don't remember exactly where or in what context, you say that there are some important principles. One is to be watchful, and the other is to be consistent. It sounds like that's what you're saying here.
Absolutely. No exceptions for anyone. Like check in, check out stuff. Like everyone knows I'm the lead pastor. Been West Brainerd for 10 years. They know my kids. My wife and I still do the stickers on the back. Whoever checked them in has to check them out. It doesn't matter. So I'm very clear with my church. I follow all the rules, and we're going to be very, very consistent with those rules. And if they apply to someone else in the church, they will apply to me too. I need to set the example as the lead pastor.
Sam, we don't have a lot of time left, but I'd like to pivot and maybe hit a couple of things kind of almost in a lightning round kind of a format. You mentioned moral failure a moment ago, and I'd like to move into that area. Number one, even though you want to, as you said, you want to be consistent and you want to be ever vigilant in dealing with moral failures, you do make a point that not all moral failures are equal. In fact, you talk about 5 different levels of moral failure. Say we don't have to. Well, I'll just say real quickly the 5. The level 1 was when the failure affects only the person involved. Level 2, when the failure affects a few people with little lasting impact. Level 3 is when the failure has the potential for a lasting impact. Level 4, when the failure has a lasting impact and will hurt many people. Level 5, when the failure has a permanent impact on the entire church. I thought that was a helpful kind of hierarchy, if you will, but it also does leave some room for value judgment. I mean, the old joke of a recession is when my neighbor loses a job. A depression is when I lose my job. You could easily apply some value judgments to these 5 levels. How do you make a determination if there's a moral failure, which level it falls into? Because that's critical in deciding what sort of consequence should occur.
Absolutely. And this is the part of the book that the publisher and I went back and forth on the most, because I felt like it was one of the strongest areas of the book, but also one of the potentially weakest areas of the book, because I don't want to give anybody an excuse like, well, this falls into level 1, therefore we don't have to do a whole lot. Let's just use some examples. Let's say you have an alcohol policy in your church, and a lot of churches do, whatever you agree about that, and somebody on staff violates that policy, for whatever reason, and they admit it. They say, you know what, I had a glass of champagne with my wife at our anniversary. I know I'm not supposed to do this. I'm very sorry. One, as I explained in the book, they called it out on themselves. There's a level of remorse and repentance, and it really only affected them. And it doesn't seem to be like this ongoing problem. In my mind, that's like a level 1 failure. It deserves a consequence. It deserves a conversation, and probably needs to be documented somewhere in a personnel file. That doesn't mean that person needs to be excused from ministry unless you've got some very pointed policy against that. So I would just, and I understand that people are going to have some different views on alcohol with all that too. That's just one example.
Sure.
You are a known predator who harms children. Well, that's as serious as it gets. Those are 2 very different things when it comes to moral failure. They are both moral failures. They are both sin, but the consequences of those things are very different. And I think part of what we've done, and part of the problem with some of the church safety issues that are out there, is we kind of lumped all of these things, all of these moral failures together. And in reality, we shouldn't do that, because what happens is it enables you actually, the higher degrees of offense, and what I mean by that, the ones that have a lot of consequences and can cause a lot of harm, actually, if you lump them in with some of the lesser offenses, then you tend to sweep the worst things under the rug because you don't want to talk about it. It puts you in a place of, we just need to let this one slide by. So I do think it's good to understand the degree of offense so that you can then understand what kind of consequence needs to be for whoever has done the offense.
Let's talk about consequence just for a moment here. One of the things that I see in my work here at Ministry Watch is that someone will engage in behavior that is not level 1 or level 2, but is level 3, 4, or 5, and they might get caught. There might even be some consequences like losing their job or reputational harm or whatever it might be. But then 6 months later, they're back in the pulpit somewhere else. A year later, they're back on the speaker circuit with a new book. I aside from just finding that distasteful, which is the fact that I find it distasteful is not necessarily a biblical reason, shall we say, but I do think that there should be some standards for restoration, but it's hard to find agreement on what those standards should be. And also, if possibly, there are some behaviors that are permanently disqualifying from ministry. Can you say a few words about that? What your thoughts are about, what restoration should look like, and this idea of permanent disqualification from ministry?
Yeah, Warren, you use the word distasteful. You're being very diplomatic. I find some of these cases repulsive, frankly.
Sure.
So I'll use the stronger word here. Goodness, I do believe there are some things that are permanently disqualifying from ministry. Restoration doesn't mean you get your job back. It means that you have been reconciled with people. So I think we got to start with a proper understanding what restoration really is and what reconciliation really is in the Bible. It doesn't mean, hey, I get all my pay package and benefits back. No, there are consequences to sin. If you harm a vulnerable person, abuse in any sort of way, I believe in most cases, that's something that is permanently disqualifying from ministry. You should not be preaching. You should not be shepherding. Pastors are to be held above reproach. And part of that qualification of being above reproach is if you are a wolf, then you don't need to be back in ministry 6 months later, a year later, whatever it is. Now, there are obviously things that people go through that can they go back speaking and preaching, depending on what it is. Sure. I don't want to be so, firm that I don't allow for somebody to speak to like, hey, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I went through this awful thing. I did this, and I want to help people not do this now, and I'm going to speak to that. I think that's a very appropriate thing to do. But you harm a child 6 months later, you abuse a woman 6 months later, you're back in the pulpit with a book. Something is terribly wrong, like just terribly wrong with most of those cases. And yeah, distasteful, sure, some of them are repulsive. I really think that we should push back harder against a lot of this, and it's part of what drove me to write the book. That's a secondary reason of why I wrote the book.
Yeah. Well, so are there any? How do you make that determination? Is there a clear, hard and fast rule, or are these just questions and decisions that need to be made in community in some sort of an accountability structure like a denomination? And sort of a corollary question there is that it seems to me that one of the reasons that we are seeing these kinds of problems in the church more and more is there has been a breakdown in denominational structure over the last 30 or 40 years. If you look at the large churches in this country 50 years ago, for one, there weren't that many large churches. And number two, they were all typically part, or almost all of them, part of a denomination and not independent. It seems like we have a whole lot of autonomy and independence going on in the evangelical church today.
We do. Now you're talking to somebody who serves at a locally autonomous church and is congregational in government and Baptist in my ecclesiology. So, your listeners know exactly where I fall on that spectrum. I would be way down the line of autonomy. That being said, I'll be the first to admit that autonomy works great at the local church level and it works horribly at the national level. We absolutely need more requirements. Let me talk about my own tribe, Southern Baptist. My church is loosely affiliated with Southern Baptist, but that's the one tribe we're connected to. We need way more guidelines around ordination. Like, well, if you're breathing and called to preach, it's like, oh, well, all of a sudden you're ordained. And I think that's a real problem. And I think that's kind of how some of the problems in the Southern Baptist Convention have surfaced. That's not the only reason, but I do think that that is a one of the fundamental reasons why is because we're not vetting people. We're just leaving that to the local church. And you may say, well, you would have to break your congregationalism. You'd have to break your ecclesiology to do something about that. I disagree. I think there's ways that we can. And I do think that we need more oversight. But here's the thing, denominations are not doing well. A lot of them are because a lot of local churches are in trouble. A lot of denominations are in trouble. And so just relying on the denominational structure is not going to be enough until denominations get healthy. So I'm with you. Hey, I wish our denominations were healthier to deal with this. Sure. But that's not going to happen here anytime soon. So I do think we need to act, and we don't need to wait on denominations to get healthy, because you may be waiting a long time.
Yep. Well, Sam, I could talk about this stuff all day long. It's kind of in my wheelhouse here at Ministry Watch. We write about these issues from all sides, a great deal. And I got to say that that means that I've read a lot of books on this topic. Yours is one of the best. Thank you so much for writing this book, for getting it out into the world, and for sharing your expertise with our listeners today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.